Good morning again, First Unitarian Church of Des Moines, and greetings on behalf of the 3,000 or so members of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, gathered this week in your fine city. I bring greetings as well from my own congregation, Central Christian Church in Indianapolis, a congregation which, like this one, is committed to building an inclusive and diverse community marked by honesty and compassion, and to making a difference in the world around us. You may have seen in the bulletin my Unitarian Credentials. While I was born and bred in the Disciples of Christ, as the niece of one of your former presidents, Eugene Pickett, I received, as did so many others, the gift of his thoughtfulness and good humor. My father, who was also a Disciples of Christ minister, loved talking religion with my Uncle Gene, and as he got older, he would sometimes say, after a conversation with his brother-in-law, "You know, I think I'm really a Unitarian." I thank you for your warm invitation to join you this morning and to share these words. In her widely acclaimed TED Talk, which many of you may have seen, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie tells of growing up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria, where her father was a professor and her mother an administrator. She was an early reader, and when she began to read at the age of 3 or 4, she read British and American books because that was what was available to her. She was also an early writer, and when she started to write around the age of 7, she wrote the same kind of stories she was reading. Her characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow, and they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. This, in spite of the fact that she lived in Nigeria with people whose skin was the color of chocolate. She had never seen snow, and they never talked about the weather because there was no need to. It took years and the discovery of African writers for her to realize that the stories she wrote did not need to center on foreigners, that she could actually write things about things and people that were familiar to her. Chimamanda Adichie went on to share that in her conventional middle-class Nigerian family, they had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. The year she turned 8, they had a new houseboy whose name was Fide, and the only thing her mother told them about Fide was that his family was very poor. They would send yams and rice and their old clothes home with him. When she didn't finish her meal, her mother said, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" She felt enormous pity for them. Then, one Saturday, they went to Fide's village to visit, and his mother showed them a beautifully patterned basket that his brother had made. She was startled. It had not occurred to her that anybody in his family could actually make something. All she had heard about them was that how poor they were, so it had become impossible for her to see them as anything but poor. Their poverty was her single story of them. Through this pair of experiences, Chimamanda Adichie illustrates what she calls the danger of the single story. Those stereotypes that we make about another country or another person or another group of people. And the problem with stereotypes, she says, is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. And when we hear only a single story about a country or person, we risk a serious misunderstanding. We may think that the single story is the only story. This lens of the single story has become for me a way to find some clarity amidst the chaos in which we live. In this challenging, frustrating, even enraging time for people of good faith and goodwill, in this world that is still full of wonder and beauty. The danger of the single story cuts different ways. Sometimes it is used maliciously and hurtfully, as in the rhetoric coming from the highest levels of government and from many of our fellow citizens. Mexicans are corrupt. Jews are trying to replace us. Black men are criminals. Immigrants are trying to take our jobs. Elected members of Congress should go back to their countries. Words that tap into fear and can lead to extremism and violence. But it's not only in these extreme cases that the danger lies. It is also important for us to remember that any of us, indeed, I would say all of us, can fall into the trap of the single story. Religions, unfortunately, are famous for telling a single story, and too often that story has been that those who belong to my camp have the truth, and all others do not. Now, as religions go, I would say that you, Unitarian Universalists, are leaders in confronting the danger of the single story because you affirm a multiplicity of stories from Jewish and Christian, humanist, and other religious and traditional sources. You seem to do a better job than most at being open to hearing and listening. But there's also a way in which any of us can see other traditions through that lens of a single story. He is a Muslim, so he must pray 5 times a day. She's a Buddhist, so she must be a vegetarian. Or the one that makes me shudder, they are Christian, so they must be homophobic. And the real problem with this, I believe, is that our incomplete understandings can cause us to mistrust one another. Our assumptions can limit our capacity to work together for the things that we all care about. In fact, what we share across the faith traditions is huge. The 7 principles of the UUA would be affirmed by anyone in my congregation. We would just throw in a little Jesus. We, along with many other Christians and Unitarian Universalists and sisters and brothers from all the world religions, share commitments to peace and justice, to inclusion and creation. And it is both our call and our challenge to turn these abstract values and commitments into concrete actions that will move our world toward their fulfillment. This summer at my congregation in Indianapolis, we are engaging in a summer of superheroes. I believe you've had a taste of that yourselves here recently. At Central Christian, we've made our way through Iron Man and Thor, Captain America and Wonder Woman, asking ourselves why we love the superheroes we love and what we look for in superheroes and in real life heroes and sheroes. And one of the lessons we're learning is that while we may not feel like heroes ourselves, and certainly would never claim that out loud, every one of us is capable of heroic actions. Despite the flaws in our character and the failures we've had, we can all stand up and speak our truth in our own unique way. Father Greg Boyle is the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, a gang intervention and rehabilitation program in Los Angeles. Father Boyle speaks all over the country and is often accompanied by former gang members who are involved in the program. In his book, Tattoos on the Heart, he tells of one such occasion when he traveled with a trainee by the name of Mario, who happens to be among the most tattooed of all of the trainees. His arms are sleeved out, his neck blackened with the name of his barrio, and his entire face covered except for right around his eyes, nose, and mouth. In the airport, as they traveled, people sidestepped around him. Mothers drew their children close to themselves. The recoiling was pronounced and widespread. And yet, were you to ask anyone at Homeboy Industries who the kindest, gentlest person who works there is, they would not say Father Boyle, they would say Mario. They spoke that night at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington. Mario and another trainee, both very nervous, shared about their lives, about 5 minutes each. Their stories were filled with violence, abandonment, torture, and abuse of every kind, and they moved people deeply. Father Boyle gave his regular speech, and then they opened it up to questions from the audience. A woman near the front stood and said she had a question for Mario. The spine shiver that went through his body was probably visible from every seat, but he approached the microphone gingerly and squeaked, "Yes?" "You say you're a father," the woman began, "and your son and daughter are starting to reach their teenage years. What advice do you give to them?" She sat down, and Mario sifted through her words for a response. He trembled some, closed his eyes, and then suddenly blurted out, As soon as those two words left his mouth, he retreated again into silence, eyes closed and clutching the microphone. He finally opened his eyes and stretched out his hand toward the woman as if he were pleading with her. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me." His last words were squeezed out, and he began to sob. The audience fell silent. The woman stood up again, pointed at Mario, and now through her own tears said, "Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out like you? You are gentle, you are kind, you are loving, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out like you." There was not much of a pause before all 1,000 people in the hall stood on their feet and began to clap. The ovation seemed to have no end. All Mario could do was hold his face in his hands, overcome with emotion. There they stood, a lanky, tattooed gang member befriending his own wound and inoculating this room from despising the wounded. Everyone recognizing themselves in the brokenness, judgment nowhere in sight, entering in that moment into the fullness of kinship. No matter who we are, and no matter what we have done in our lives, we are part of the web of life, held by love, and invited to join in what we disciples call a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. But we cannot do it alone. We need each other. The challenges of this world are too big for any of us to work in isolation. And I'm aware that I am preaching to the choir here, as I know that this congregation is connected to a wide array of partners in this city and beyond. So perhaps what we can do this morning is to celebrate the ties that bind us together, the common values that guide our struggle, and celebrate as well the power that comes when people of all faiths and no faith join together in the movement for justice, the movement for compassion, the movement for kinship with each other and with everyone. If there is to be a single story, let it be this: that every person on this planet and the earth itself is sacred, and we are called to live accordingly. May it be so.